History's strange, it's alien, and it won't give us what we would like to have.
Glad you're along with us for this edition of Bill Mick Live. Tuesday, 8 o'clock hours, we devote to Dave Bowman, and Dave does history with his Liberty 250 project that will take us up through the 4th of July, 1776. We'll do that next, not this coming, but the 4th of July following for that 250th anniversary of the U.S. Headline today at BillMick.com. AIAIO. We devoted our first 2 hours to those topics, and you can catch up with them in the podcast section, top of the page at BillMick.com, along with our Florida Roundtable podcast. And if you want to follow us on Instagram, you do that at WMMB Radio. Dave, as we take this march toward American independence, a lot of factors went into play. Where are we going to go today?
Oddly enough, we're going to go to India, where in the 1800s, Britain, of course, had turned India into a colony like us, and they had a problem, Bill. Their problem was they had a bunch of cobras, snakes,
yes,
in India. And apparently, and there's some debate about whether this actually happened or not, but apparently the snakes were biting people and people were being killed by the snakes. And the British government decided, we got to do something about this. So they hit upon a scheme. For every dead cobra that you bring us, we'll give you a bounty on that cobra.
Oh, you mean like we do pythons in Florida?
Exactly. Okay. I was actually going to say that. Before you think this program was too ridiculous, understand that Florida is doing this today with giant anacondas.
Yes, we are.
So the story goes that at the end of this little program, India ended up with more cobras than they had when they started. How does that happen? Well,
capitalism.
Economics 101. Turns out that if you pay somebody to bring you dead cobras, some of those people will start breeding cobras just to kill them and collect the money.
There will be a cobra farm. Yes, sir.
When the British government realized that people were doing that, they stopped the program, and guess what the people did with the cobras they'd been raising?
Let them loose.
They just let them loose. Said you had more cobras than you imagine. And history has this way of showing us that if people would just stop and think for a minute, or maybe talk to each other, things might be different, or maybe they wouldn't be different, but at least they would be more sensible. You would think that by the 1800s, the British government, the British Empire, of all the empires in all the history of the world, would have known better than to pursue this infamous cobra policy. Back in 1733, Parliament had a very similar problem. The problem was the French, which is a recurring theme in British history, of course, but sure. The problem was the French were growing sugar on Saint-Domingue and other French possessions in the Caribbean. But so were the British. The British were growing sugar on Jamaica and Barbados, and they were exporting this sugar as were the French doing so. Now, the problem the British government had was that the French sugar, which they turn into molasses, was better quality, it was better availability, there was more of it, and it was cheaper than the British molasses. And guess who was buying all this molasses? Rhode Island and the rest of New England, because those Puritans up there love their rum. And you make rum out of molasses.
Okay.
So the colonies, the American colonies, were buying all this French rum because it was cheaper than the British molasses, buying all this French molasses. So the British government said, well, this isn't fair to our British sugar farmers in Jamaica and Barbados. So they put into place what we would today call a protective tariff. They began to tax the French molasses at 6 pence per gallon. Oddly enough, the imports of British molasses did not improve or increase at all. In fact, they went down. And over the course of 30 years, the British, trying to enforce this molasses tax, as it were, spent £7,000 more trying to enforce it than they ever raised from it. Now, £7,000 today doesn't sound like a lot, but in 1763 terms, That's millions of dollars in today's money. It didn't work. Why not? Well, economics. Just like the cobras, the colonists found ways to get around this 6 pence tax per gallon on molasses. They started smuggling. They started bribing tax officials. They started insurance fraud schemes. All of these things that we would consider to be criminal. And the British government's reaction to all of that? Want to take a stab at what it was?
War.
No. The British said, who cares? It's just molasses. It's just rum. And once you start allowing that to happen, once you start saying, well, the law doesn't really, we're not going to really worry about it, you send a message. And the message is, just do things yourself. We don't care. And that makes it hard to change things when you do care.
And we pick it up in 60 seconds on WMMB. So the Brits go from caring and levying a tax to not caring and saying, okay, we're not really going to enforce that. So they don't care, Dave, as you said, until they decide they do care again.
Well, and it's that catalyst. What makes them decide to start caring that really impacts our story? The tax was just, I guess you could argue that it was a protective tariff, but it didn't really function as one because French imports of molasses to the colonies went up, British imports went down, and rum sales went through the roof, and people in New England were getting quite wealthy off selling rum because, let's face it, rum is delicious. It's fantastic. I mean, it really is even today. But this tax caused people to do things that were criminal. They began bribing tax officials. The biggest thing they did, and the way that we were able to actually unravel this, was the insurance records, because they would insure the cargo of the ship for its full value, but then underreport it when it got to port. Say, well, it wasn't that much, sorry. So if the ship disappeared or sank or whatever, they could collect the full value. But of course, if it didn't, then you didn't pay the taxes on it. And the British enforcement of this was so lax that it became almost a joke. And it's not like the British government didn't know that. They just didn't care. But by the time...
Like in London is like in Tallahassee with homeowners insurance. The insurance companies run things for a while.
Certainly seems that way, doesn't it?
Yeah.
By the time the French and Indian War ends in 1763, though, Britain is beginning to change its long-term thinking. The British Empire has literally just almost tripled in size. And all of a sudden they have all of this new land, what we call Louisiana, Canada, all these kinds of things. And they have to figure out how to govern this efficiently and effectively. But what they've done is they've taught the American colonials for the last 30 years, the last generation, just run things yourself. We don't really care. We're not, yeah, we have rules, but do what's best for you. In 1763, though, as the British Parliament and the British King begin to look at this, they look at it as, well, the problem is if we let them run things the way they want to run things over there, they're going to start more wars. They're going to go after the Spanish in Florida. They're going to go after the Native American tribes in the central part of the continent. And we can't have that. So we're going to pass rules and laws that basically will say to the American colonials, yes, you thought you were fighting to expand. You thought that you were fighting this 7 years war to grow your country, to increase economic activity and opportunities. But no, you're going to be like us. You're going to be confined to just this little tiny area. Even as your population expands, you can't grow, you can't move. And by the way, we're going to leave troops here to enforce that. Well, we're not going to tell you that. We're going to say it's for your protection, but the troops are going to tell you that you can't go west of the Appalachian Mountains. And the troops are going to start enforcing these taxes. And the troops are going to start quartering themselves to make sure that you behave the way we want you to behave. And of course, this, after 30 years of running our things ourselves, is not going to go over well. And it's going to create a situation where, though we learn to live without Britain and to outwit the crown, this is going to start lighting the spark of revolution. And eventually, it's going to fall on the head of George III.
And we get into that as we continue. Dave Does History on Bill Mick Live. Appreciate that you join us here on 92.7 FM WMMB. Make sure you make us your number one preset on the iHeartRadio app. Most of Brevard already has. Might as well join the crowd.
It's a take on history you won't find anywhere else. Dave Does History on Bill Mick Live.
And the McPherson Financial Group bringing you this hour of the program. Appreciate that you join us here on WMMB, especially on these Tuesdays. Dave puts a lot of work into this as we're taking a look at the run-up to the American Revolution. We're calling it Liberty 250. So, Dave, you've laid out the premise or the preface to this, and now we're going to catch up a little on King George. Tell me what's up.
Yeah, we're going to take a slight detour here, and we're going to talk about the man we've all been taught to hate. To us, King George III he's a tyrant, he's evil. I mean, we say it right there in the Declaration of Independence that, such character as this is a tyrant and is to be despised. As I've said in the past, King George III is comparable in many ways to Herod the Great. Most Western Americans think of Herod the Great as evil, bad, whatever. And we never question, why is he called the Great? We never think about that question. We never bother to learn who he was or why he was or how he even became king in Judea. We don't understand that he was one of the best friends of Augustus Caesar and Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. He was the Great. And in many ways, George III, who is seen by us as a tyrant, as an evil man, is regarded by most of history and most of the rest of the world as not so bad. He's actually a pretty reasonable guy. So how did we get to where we are with him? Well, during that 30 years from 1733 to 1760, George is, of course, being raised as a young man. He is the son of Frederick William, who is the Prince of Wales, which means that George is technically third in line behind George I, who is actually German. We've talked about this in the past. These are Germans who came from Hanover in Germany when they were offered the crown of England by Parliament. We're not going to go through all that, but the reality of it is that George I moved his family from Germany to England to better rule England because that was the more important crown than the German one was. His father, George's father, William, died in 1751. This really kind of impacted George, Prince George, who was kind of estranged from his father, and his mother really became in charge of his his raising up. His mother, Augusta, was deeply religious and very protective. And she took George, Prince George, and really sheltered him, really kept him. In fact, in his entire life, the man who would become George III never traveled more than 50 miles from London, ever. Never went to Wales, never went to Scotland, never went to Ireland, never went to Hanover in Germany where he was the king. Never did any of that, never did any traveling, stayed at home. His mother, with deep religious values, impressed those upon Prince George, and Prince George became very adapted to that behavior. And in fact, it was that lifestyle that would most set him apart as an English monarch.
So George is raised as someone we would likely respect, Dave.
I don't know respect might not be the best word, but he certainly fit the Puritan values of New England. Now, the behavior might be a little bit different, but the values were certainly there. He was very sober. He was not known to do a lot of drinking, very moral, very religiously earnest, and he was far more interested in agriculture than anything else. He could hold a conversation with you about agriculture, about soil types and plants and whatever. His nickname, of course, would become Farmer George. That's what the British people would call him. He was also raised to believe very firmly in moral behavior. Unlike most British monarchs and most television would have you believe, George III would never cheat on his wife, Charlotte. They would have 15 children together, and including the infamous George IV, who didn't quite live the same lifestyle. But the bottom line is he was very upstanding in his personal behavior. But with that comes a certain mindset, Bill. The reason that he believed this is that he saw himself as a moral rebuke to the corruptions of the court life, and he planned to rule accordingly. So when he became king in 1760, he took an approach that was much different, although not totally different than other kings, in this divine right mindset. The colonials, who up to this point had been dealing with George II and George I, who, were more typical, now found themselves facing a man who believed that he had been chosen by God to preserve the moral order, not just the empire, but the moral order of the empire, and moral compromise was weakness. He was not yielding. He believed that if he yielded, that he was yielding to dishonor, and that laws once made were sacred. This is the mindset that George III comes in with.
He was the Pope of England.
In many ways. He could not abide people who would not obey his laws, to which he had given his assent, which is one of the things we complain about in the Declaration of Independence. He saw those laws as binding, not just because he said them, but because he was chosen by God and put on the throne of God. If you didn't follow the laws, including that idiotic molasses tax, you were disobeying God. And he was not going to compromise on any of this. Now, there is a theory here that perhaps had he traveled to the New World and met Americans, remember that the only Americans he ever met were Benjamin Franklin and, John Adams. Perhaps if he had traveled to America and met Isaac and Ebenezer and Charles and Martha and some of these other people, maybe he would have seen it differently. In fact, there's a theory that he could have said, you know what, my grandfather moved from Hanover to London because it was a better place to rule the kingdom from. Now that the empire has tripled in size, maybe I should move from London to Boston and rule there. Had he done that, maybe things turn out differently. But they didn't. And George III saw the monarchy as his divine duty. He had been raised to preserve, not experiment, not retreat, but to preserve the empire that God had given him and England. He was ready to rule an empire just in time for that empire to begin to unravel. And he started it by telling the colonials, "Hitherto shalt thou come and no further. The Appalachians are the border, and I don't care how much sacrifice, how much money, how much work you did. You do not cross those, and my troops will make sure of it."
Setting the stage for what's to come, and we explore it more as we continue. Dave Does History on Bill Mick Live on Moments, right here on 92.7 FM WMMB.
This is Dave Does History on Bill Mick Live.
Thanks, Victor Lyle, the McPherson Financial Group, this hour's sponsor. Questions or commentary on the history as presented today, 321-768-1240. We'll get to those calls as time allows. As King George has assumed the throne, putting some restrictions on the colonials that they are not appreciative of. Dave, what's happening next?
So by the time the French and Indian War ends in 1763, and by the way, the treaties that end this thing are a mess. I mean, the treaties themselves are fine, but the communication is so slow that the French have actually sent a new governor to New Orleans, and he actually gets imprisoned by the British on his way there, gets released, goes back to France, turns around, goes back to all of that just to get to New Orleans to discover that it's not yours anymore, it's Spain's now, because the treaties are so slow. It's a mess. But Britain has obtained basically North America except for the Spanish West. Canada, Louisiana has gone to Spain, all of these things. But this creates all kinds of new problems. Number one problem that George III now has is he has a debt in 1763 dollars, a debt, not a deficit, a debt of 122 million pounds. The debt has essentially doubled. And George III, as we've talked about in the past, is a fiscal conservative. He does not believe in spending money. The British troops that are going to be stationed in America to, quote unquote, protect us are going to cost about 400,000 pounds a year. And the Native American tribes that were formerly allied with Britain are already causing problems. We could spend some time on Pontiac's rebellion, but you can Google that yourself or use AI to find out about it. Pontiac is leading a Native American uprising because he doesn't think the British are honoring their treaties. And ostensibly, these troops are there to help solve that, but to protect us from that. But really, they're not interested in doing it. So in 1763, October of 1763, George III comes out with his proclamation of 1763. In essence, what this does is it forbids any colonial settlements west of the Appalachian Mountains. Now, keep in mind, we'd already done this. We'd already, the Cumberland Gap, Ohio Valley. George Washington himself has already formed a land investment company and purchased the right to lands west of the Appalachian Mountains, and is nearly financially ruined by this because all of a sudden it's against the rules. Now, the intent here is to stabilize those relationships with the Native American tribes and control expansion. But colonials see this as a betrayal. We see this as we'd been promised land for wartime service. We'd been promised, all these things to do, pensions and land and all this kinds of stuff. And now King George has essentially said, no, thou shalt not. And we see this as a betrayal. This is the act of a tyrant. This is the act of a person who is trying to control us. And for the last 30 years, what have we been learning? We've been learning that Britain, the government, parliament, they don't really care. As long as we just, pretend to be part of the empire, they'll pretend to rule us and everybody will be fine. But now George III comes in with this moral mindset that I'm going to run things, that God has told me to run things, and if you disobey my laws, you're a sinner going to hell, and I'm going to, it's my job not to let you do that because you are my children. He, with the stroke of a royal quill, he revokes all those dreams that the colonials have about moving westward. Something we don't talk about is these 13 American colonies were relatively small. If you look on a map, they're not as, each colony is, the largest of them are about the size of England, not the island of Great Britain. And by this point, the population of the colonies is exceeding that of London. We need to move. We need to expand. We have room to expand. And the British government, instead of saying, well, maybe we need to work out a way that we can expand this stuff, just says, no, thou shalt not. And of course, they back this up with imperial authority. Troops are stationed in colonial towns. They're quartered in people's houses. More importantly, customs enforcement begins to really have some teeth in it. Britain, 122 million pounds in debt, suddenly decides that, well, maybe we should really actually enforce these taxes that we've been kind of lax about, that molasses tax again. Well, that, of course, is going to affect the profit margins of these New England rum makers, as well as other things along the way, because, you know, sugar is used for other things too. The Proclamation of 1763, it marks more than just a geographical boundary. It is an ideological shift in the mindset of Great Britain. For the first time, colonialists begin to feel that their rights as Englishmen, those storied protections of property, representation, and liberty, are now conditional. They're negotiable. They're distant. And for the first time, some are beginning to wonder whether the empire that had protected them from the French might now be turning it into an empire that needed to be protected from them. The discontent is not yet revolutionary, but it is restless. It's in this era that we get James Otis. Taxation without representation is happening. This Parliament is debating these new taxes that we're going to talk about next week, that we're all familiar with: Stamp Acts, Sugar Acts, those kinds of things. All these taxes are coming with the enforcement behind them. In London, they don't see it this way. They see this as a sensible policy. This makes sense. We want to avoid conflict with the Native American tribes. We need to enforce, we got to raise money because these, we're in debt. But in the colonials, it was seen as a breach of trust. And it wouldn't be the last breach of trust that we would have. This proclamation of 1763 is really just the beginning. Parliament would move to reform the customs service. They've tightened port regulations. They're going to shut down American ports that don't cooperate. Most explosively, they're going to try to make the colonies pay off part of that debt. Now, they're going to say that it's, quote, our fair share. Does this sound familiar?
It does.
But it's too late. The War of the 7 Years' War is over. The empire is whole, but it's beginning to crack. And that sense of shared purpose that had carried the colonies through that war was now gone. In its place, we have suspicion, resentment, and a slowly growing awareness that peace might actually be more dangerous than war.
And we pick it up with your questions in 60 seconds on WMMB. Dave, let's get to the phones. We start with Keith in Palm Bay. Hey, Keith, good morning. What are you thinking today?
Hey, great show. What I'm thinking is, since Dave's using all the degrees the king was making, they were preserved. But I wonder, since they didn't have cell phones and it all came over by the Great Pond, did any of these diplomats or soldiers on the ground adjust the proclamation to their agenda like the guys did in the Obama administration? Has there ever been a look at the results of the proclamation, if it did what it said it was going to do?
If they were tampered with by governors or soldiers that either in transit to America or once they got here?
Well, even when they get here, to embellish it into where their agenda on the ground is being carried out instead of what the king actually proclaimed.
Interesting question. Dave, any knowledge there?
If I'm following the question correctly, I don't think you're going to find any cases of anybody actually rewriting the Proclamation of 1763 to fit a local agenda. As for whether or not it was followed, this is part of the problem. Got a lot of Americans who are heavily invested in moving west of the Appalachian Mountains. They have reasons to be there. There's economic opportunities there. And for 30 years, they've been doing things themselves. They had this molasses tax that they just ignored and did what they wanted to do anyway. And so at first, of course, there's that same mindset. It's just more nonsense from London. We don't need to worry about it. But what's changed is now we have King George, who sees this as a moral imperative, as opposed to George II, who didn't care. The impact becomes more and more strict. Starting in 1763, the king, George III, makes it clear that he wants these laws enforced rigorously. And the reaction of the colonials, as you probably know, begins to build in resentment. Starting in 1763, we get, hey, we're being taxed without representation. But within 10 years, well, 7 years from now, we're going to be having Americans shot in the streets.
Let's get back to the phones. Line 1. You're next on Bill Mick Live. Good morning.
Great program, Mario, Cape Canaveral.
Yeah, Mario.
The colonists had a history going back to Scotland, even 100 years earlier, where they were they had been oppressed and murdered and savaged by the English. So I think there was a lot of animosity towards the English anyway that goes way back, and I'd like to know more about that.
Thanks, Mario. Dave, thoughts there?
Well, you always have these mindsets of we're being oppressed, but keep in mind that the colonials by this point, and not all of them were Scottish, the vast majority were English. You also had Germans and Irish and Spanish involved in this as well. The mindset, of course, for 30 years has been we're being allowed to run things ourselves. This is why we set up colonial legislators, because Britain didn't care, didn't want to get involved with it. The only reason Britain gets involved now with these oppressive measures is because of this $122 million pound debt. Again, that's 1763 money. That's a lot of money. And this mindset of George III, which differs from previous monarchs, which is God told me to make you listen to me. And his mindset of I'm in charge, not you. And as that begins to build resentment, yes, they're going to look at Enlightenment philosophy, they're going to look at history, they're going to look at all of these things, and all of that is going to come into play.
Your view, if he came to Boston and started governing from there, that this would have been a different world altogether?
I think anybody that came to America in that era would have been changed by it, and I think George III would have been changed by it. Can you imagine Farmer George in America? He would have loved
that. Would have been something. What are we looking at next week, Dave? I got 10 seconds.
Next week, we start looking at the new taxes, the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act.
Very good. Dave Bowman, thank you. Thank you also to the McPherson Financial Group. They brought you the hour. Wide Open Wednesday tomorrow.
Check out more stories from history at davedoeshistory.org.